Yeah, you could.
Oh, yeah.
There's a marker that you have to put on your side. Put this on. Okay. This label keeps.
I don't know. Is this working? Or? Yeah, you can. No, I'm not. How is this? Good. Okay, so I wanted to. This paper is a little abstract for me, but I'm going to be talking about texts that you all probably know very, very well, especially the members of the group. But I wanted to frame frame language as a question or as a problem even, and I think that generally language is something that we take for granted as a not we in this room, but people who read texts and kind of assume, language is part of the metadata. It's how you classify texts, and it's almost a brute fact about a text that it's written in a certain language. And there are these problems that I think that Dandin and the Mirror evoke, and so I wanted to begin a little bit before Dandin, in fact 3 generations before him, with his great-grandfather, Damodara, who was a native of Achalapura in modern Maharashtra. He was a gifted poet, which let him rub shoulders with some of the luminaries of the 6th century, including the poet Parvi and the Ganga king Durvanita. And he landed in the court of the Pallava king Simhavishnu, from where, according to Dandin's Avanti Sundari, he supplied the Deccan. This is letter A on your handout. He supplied, you all have a handout, right? Okay. Supplied the Deccan with excellent works like Gandhamadana, as well as theoretical treatments of Sanskrit and Prakrit literature. So it's very interesting to me that Dandin has to say Sanskrit and Prakrit literature instead of just kavya. And we can think about why this is. Under Durvanita's patronage, Damodara lived in a Kannada-speaking world. Under Simhavishnu's, he lived in a Tamil-speaking world. And his own world, his professional world, so to speak, was a Sanskrit and Prakrit world. He was kind of drawn to Simhavishnu's court because of this Sanskrit Arya verse that he composed. And there's a story which I don't understand because it's lacunose in the Avanti Sundari manuscript, but about him singing Prakrit songs at the Pallava court. So I think this language problem applies to Dandin even more than it does to Damodara, because he lived, taking a few things for granted, he lived in Kanchi, which is a Tamil-speaking area. His own works are in Sanskrit. The literary genealogy that he places himself in, according to the beginning of the Avanti Sundari, is made up entirely of Sanskrit and Prakrit authors. Not only that, his mirror of literature seems to explicitly exclude Tamil and other regional languages from the realm of literature that it theorizes, namely kavya. The mirror tells us that a work of kavya can be in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Upper Brahmsha, or a mixture of these languages. Dandin thus seems to accept a strict limitation on the linguistic parameters of kavya. In Sheldon Pollock's formulation, I quote, theorists were fully aware of the complex language environment of the everyday world, but the codes they regarded as qualified for literature constituted a dramatically smaller set, indeed a closed set. And we were just reading the beginning of the the Kavya Darsha in one manuscript last night, and I think this is very clear from the beginning of the Kavya Darsha, that language is something universal, but only to the extent that it's a communicative practice. When we start adding an evaluative dimension where certain uses of language are good or bad, then there are criteria that we need to meet, and one of those criteria is something that later authors, I'm thinking of Poja in particular, would call the jati, or the type of language. So it's very surprising that when people start to think seriously about writing kavya in regional languages, they've often turned to Dandin's mirror. In fact, some members of this group, including myself, might want to make an even stronger claim that people started to think seriously about writing kavya in regional languages because they studied Dandin's mirror. And this is one of the reasons we're here today. Yigal has already said all this, but the mirror, written in Sanskrit, seemingly limiting the languages of literature to Sanskrit, Prakrit, Abhramsha, was adapted or translated into a huge number of other languages. So here are the two questions that I want to frame. Number one, how should we think about the contradiction or apparent contradiction between what the mirror actually says about language and what its historical effects were? Number two, what does this contradiction tell us about the languages themselves? What does it tell us about the structure of the language order that kavya reproduces? How exactly were these languages related to each other in the minds of the people who produced kavya? What are the roles that Sanskrit and other languages play? What expressive possibilities were they associated with? Our answer, in the best case, should explain both the mirror's linguistic, I don't want to call it conservatism now, but the fact that he enunciates the same limitation or restriction or parameters that earlier authors had done. But it should also explain its multilingual history of effects. So I'll give some examples of the kinds of answers that I think we should avoid. Well, Dandin really didn't mean it. Or alternatively, Dandin did mean it, but his readers just didn't take this part of the mirror seriously. And psychologizing answers like this are hard to put into evidence. They often implicitly refer to larger scale ideologies, and that appeal is something that I have a problem with. If we say that Dandin was in the grip of an ideology that held Sanskrit to be supreme, and this grip was somehow looser for his later readers, this doesn't really add anything to what we already know. In fact, I would say it subtracts from what we already know. Except the word ideology, which is rarely used innocently and usually carries the sense that people's thoughts and beliefs are determined by substructural phenomena over which they have no control, political or economic relations. So every case is different, but in general, I like this bit from the Paradiso where Dante says, it's natural that man should speak, but precisely how, nature leaves it to his preference. My suggestion here is that Dandin's mirror was instrumental in reimagining Sanskrit, not just as one among several literary languages, but as the single literary language that underlies all of the others. Despite the advertised title of my talk, I no longer think that this makes Sanskrit into a meta-language. I think that that's a useful word, but it's best reserved for another role that Sanskrit plays, namely a language in which we talk about literature as opposed to a language in which literature is composed. I think it's important that Dandin actually did choose Sanskrit for this role. It's more important than we might think, given the fact that Tamil was also used as a meta-language for literature at this time, and Prakrit as well, although I think that the Tamil case, and especially the Prakrit case, are not really on our radar when we think about these questions. We might say instead that in Dandin's vision, literature has a final vocabulary, and that its language is Sanskrit. And I'm taking this phrase final vocabulary from Richard Rorty, using it in a specialized sense that Rorty would definitely object to. And final vocabulary is the unalterable vocabulary of a given form of life, meaning that we can't change it without changing the form of life itself. And it admits no further abstraction. It can't be reduced to some other vocabulary. So to say that Sanskrit is the language of literature's final vocabulary is to say not only that it's theoretically possible to write Sanskrit literature in other languages, but that all literature, if it's literature at all, must be written in Sanskrit on some level. Now these seem like preposterous claims, but I think that in Dandin's world they make a kind of sense. And I think that these claims are actually our best hope for answering the questions that I began with. So the special status that the Sanskrit language takes on in the mirror is related to the kind of text that the mirror is. And here I want to make a heuristic distinction between three kinds of texts on poetics, which Yigal has already glanced upon. The first is a descriptive catalog of figures. In this category, I would place the Alankara Dappana. Those of you who have been here know what that text is. Sections of the Subodha Alankara I also think belong in this category. Maybe sections of Bhamaha's Ornament of Literature as well. And here language is more or less an accidental feature of the discourse. The second group of texts are more concerned with the theory of literary language and figuration. And here's where most of the Kashmiri authors fit. Language in this group of texts is an object of discourse, but precisely what kind of object, what level of specificity, depends on the theory. I think that texts in this category are usually more concerned with how language operates as a representational system in general than with the specific features of the Sanskrit language. Many of you know, and Yigal has written about this, in Kashmiri poetics there's a shift from grammatical conceptualizations of figures like metaphor, where it depends on the compounding possibilities of the Sanskrit language, to more cognitive semantic conceptualizations of the same figures, which we see in Udpata and later authors. So Dandin's mirror represents this third type of text on poetics, which supplies a generative grammar of literature. It presents a poetic vocabulary, and it demonstrates the principles by which the elements of this vocabulary can be arranged into new combinations. And like generative grammars, the mirror allows us to think of the infinite variety of surface forms as the result of computational operations on a finite number of elements. So what kinds of operations? I think that some of the previous talk referred to some of these more general aspects of Dandin's analytic project, these vectors of similarity and difference. But I was thinking of Dandin's treatment of upama, where we have a number of operations that are applied to a kind of basic figure, and those operations are inversion, conjunction, recursion, or something like that. I'm thinking of anyonya, negation of individual terms, and I mean, we could go on and on. In fact, we could go on forever. I mean, that's the point. So what kinds of elements are these operations applied to? Now here I want to suggest that the elements are not abstract objects defined by their formal relations to each other. So we're not talking about upameyas, upamanas, and so on. But they're actually particular word meanings. I've after a conversation with Thibault yesterday, I'm inclined to call them semantimes or something like that. I say word meanings because I think of them as the meanings of Sanskrit words in particular. For example, Rajiva, Vaktra, Netra, Nilotpala. Once you hear those words, they kind of fit, the relations between them become apparent to you, even without being told what those relations are. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that inclines me to describe this vocabulary as final in Rorty's sense. It's that its elements bear relationships to each other which are not really up for debate. They're established or pre-established by poetic convention. In fact, Dandin himself refers to prasiddhi that obtains between these elements. Yes, and Yigal argued in his Shlesha book that the mirror presupposes just these conventional relationships, and by regarding these elements, these basic semantimes, as texts already read, which is something that was taken from Jonathan Culler, who in turn took that from Roland Barthes. We can see Dandin's discussion of figures as essentially having this intertextual dimension, where he systematically traverses this discursive space constituted by these groups of semantimes, or words like Rajiva, Vaktra, Netra, Nilotpala, etc. So instead of saying that Rajiva and Vaktra instantiate the abstract relationship of Upamana and Upameya, we could just as easily say, and more convincingly say, that Upamana and Upameya are defined as things that relate to each other, as a Rajiva relates to a Vaktra. And I think that this is the sense in which Sanskrit's poetic vocabulary is a final vocabulary. It is the language of poetic thought. So there are some indications, which I'll get to in the mirror, that Dandin envisions Sanskrit not just as a language of literature, but as the language of literature. But it's also just as clear that Dandin held Prakrit literary traditions in a very high regard. We can talk in the questions about the evidence for that, but I think this is pretty uncontroversial. Now, this apparent contradiction is pretty important. The relation between Sanskrit and Prakrit is a model for the language order as a whole. And this gives us a sense of the language order's internal structure. So understanding that internal structure will allow us to understand how other languages might actually come to form a part of it. So I want to turn to the explicit discussion of literary languages, which occurs in both Dandin's Mirror and Pamaha's Ornament. And this is a neat example of how these two authors can invest the exact same phenomenon with a completely different significance. Pamaha, this is probably B on your handout, yes. Pamaha says that kavya can be considered threefold according to its division into Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha. That's it. Is this an empirical observation? Is it a regulative principle? Is it some statement of the linguistic conditions of possibility of kavya? We don't know. As it stands, this statement is inherently open to black swan type objections and falsifications. We know, for instance, that there was a culture in Central Asia, more or less contemporaneous with Pamaha, that was producing Buddhist literature on the basis of Sanskrit models in the Tocharian language. Just kind of random example of what are probably dozens of possible examples. Does this falsify Pamaha's claim? Is there some non-arbitrary reason why those texts don't count? Would Tocharian be included in the category of Apabhramsha? I don't know the answer to any of these questions. Dandin gives us the same classification. He adds this the possibility of a mixture between these languages, and that's handout C. I've given you kind of all of Dandin's remarks on literary languages. Unlike Bhamaha, he actually defines what Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha are. And this makes the classification a lot more robust. Dandin's definition includes empirical features. For instance, Apabhramsha is the language of the poetry of the Abhira people, or Prakrit is the language of works such as the building of the bridge. But he also takes over a key conceptual feature from earlier discussions of language, and that is the derivational relationship between Sanskrit and Prakrit. So Prakrit words can be classified as identical to a corresponding Sanskrit word, derived, that's tatsama, derived from a corresponding Sanskrit word, that's tadbhava, or regional, that's deshi. In the first case, no general rules need to be invoked to explain how the Sanskrit and Prakrit words are related. In the last case, no general rules can be invoked. Dandin doesn't exactly tell us how to cash out these distinctions, but already in his time, they defined the scope of the systematic knowledge of Prakrit. And that knowledge consisted, on the one hand, of transformational rules to derive these tadbhava forms, and replacement rules to define deshi forms. And although Dandin himself doesn't mention it, Ratna Srityana does mention that the same principle of classification applies to Apabhramsha as well. And in fact, this is exactly how Apabhramsha grammars are written when they are ultimately written in the 12th century. So this schema, as I call it, places Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha within a single field of derivation. In this sense, it accomplishes something similar to the modern concept of a language family. But in contrast to this concept, the relation between Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha is, in Dandin's thinking at least, is not historical. These languages occupy different regions within a space of synchronic linguistic possibilities. To invoke Jonathan Culler once again, this space is the discursive space of literature. This space was unified in the sense that these languages were all in principle mutually intelligible. Now, I don't use this phrase casually because most people fall back on mutual intelligibility when they don't have any other way of describing the relations between languages. But I mean something very specific by this, is that in practice, there were bodies of grammatical and lexicographic rules that explained how to move from one region of this space to another. And hence it was also unified in the sense that the same people, including Dandin himself, were reading and sometimes producing texts in all three of these languages. Although for Dandin, I think Prakrit and Sanskrit texts are more important than Apabhramsha texts. But I'll just note here that this interpretation also allows us to understand this metaphor of the body of literature, the kavya sharira, that Dandin, that's another concept that Dandin takes over from earlier texts. We can understand it in a broader sense. There's been a lot of discussion here in Jerusalem about this kavya sharira and how we should understand it, but I'll note that when it applies to an individual work, the body of literature is a metaphor of substance as opposed to accident. The body is that without which the poem cannot exist. It's that to which the individual ornaments or alankaras are applied. But when it applies to literature as a whole, the body is a metaphor of integrity. Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha are all part of the same discourse. They're all part of the same practice. And this is the concept that gets us to Rajashekhar and this idea of the Kavya Purusha, where the different parts are made out of different languages. So we can speak of the languages of Kavya as exhibiting this very Dandin type of quality of unity in diversity. And kavya we can think of as a polyglossic practice that is nevertheless monoglossic on a deeper level. And we don't have to believe, following Bakhtin, that polyglossia is always good, monoglossia is always bad. So this feature poses a really big theoretical and practical problem for kavya in regional languages. Should Kannada, for instance, be introduced into the same linguistic space that contains Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha, and if so, how do you do that? So, to put some of these pieces together, in order to count, a language had to appear within a larger field of languages that were systematically related to each other, and especially to Sanskrit. But why should this be the case? We can easily think of cultures in which the primary languages of literature were not especially closely related to each other. Greek and Latin in the Roman Empire, for instance. I think that in order to count and to work as a language of kavya, a language needed to have access to the final vocabulary of poetry, which for Dandin was a Sanskrit vocabulary. A language needed to be able to translate words such as Rajiva, Vaktra, Netra, Nilotpala, but in a very special sense that would preserve not only the meanings of these words, but their seemingly innate capacity to enter into certain figural relations. We could say that this kind of translation preserves not just the arthas of the word, but their samarthyas. Rajashekara defines this translatability very precisely and elegantly, I think, in the beginning of the Karpura Manjari, which is on your handout. This is in the defense of Prakrit. Somebody asked the Sutratara, why are you staging a play in Prakrit? Nobody does this, and this is what he says. The particular meanings are the same. The words are the same, even if they undergo some change. A literary work is a particular kind of statement, whatever language it happens to be in. So I'm sure that we can all think of examples of this translatability. In fact, this workshop is basically an exercise in this kind of translation. I gave you an extremely literal-minded example of this translation from Swayambhu's Handbook of Prakrit and Apabhramsha meters from the middle of the 9th century. It's just something that I was reading recently, and Swayambhu will sometimes quote a Sanskrit verse to illustrate a particular meter, but he does this thing where he translates the Sanskrit verse into Prakrit. And he does this in the verse on your handout, which is a Pushpitagra verse that's originally from the play Pancharatra, which is traditionally since the early 20th century, ascribed to Pasa. Swayambhu actually ascribes it to Kalidasa, which is very interesting for completely unrelated reasons, but you see, I've given you both the Sanskrit original and the Prakrit version. This is an example of moving within this space of languages. And you can see how easy it is. In fact, it preserves the meter exactly. Now, Swayambhu has had to write some pretty barbarous Prakrit forms, but it basically works. And so I think that this is the kind of relation between languages that Dandin has in mind. This is a kind of weird example, but it's illustrative because of how weird and how rare it is. We don't need to translate between these languages because Sanskrit, Prakrit, and to a lesser extent, again, Apabhramsha, are already translations of each other. And people will cite them without translating them. And if you've ever read a kind of any work of Alankara Shastra, that uses real examples, you know that the language is, so long as you're within the space of Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Upapramsha, the language is basically indifferent. Now, so yes, it's very easy to move within this space of the three languages, the Pasha Trayam, that Dandin articulates. Dandin is not the first to articulate this, as I said. It's a very traditional way of conceiving languages. So what would it take to make the Sanskrit vocabulary of Kavya translatable in other languages besides Prakrit and Upapramsha? So the whole discourse of regional language poetics is devoted to answering this question. And I think that one of the reasons that Dandin is so important to that discourse is because he does two things. Number one, he articulates very clearly, and we've seen this with the Atishayokti verses, even if his verse is not quite as nice as Bhamaha's, it's clearer, it's white, okay, it's white, we get it. He articulates what the vocabulary of Kavya is. And in framing the languages of Kavya, that's the first thing he does. The second thing is that he frames the languages of Kavya as this unified field within which that vocabulary can be translated. And in doing that, he implicitly allows for the possibility of local reconfigurations of that field. And I say local because it's important to recognize we've been thinking about and trying to look for evidence of these horizontal interactions between regional literary cultures. And they were very clearly in conversation, but there was never a single schematic representation that emerged that encompassed all of the regional languages. It's always Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Upapramsha, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Kannada, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Telugu. Usually Prakrit drops out of the equation after a certain point. So this is a conversation that is mediated by Sanskrit in an important way. I'm sure that there are much better examples, but I gave you a pair of verses from the Kaviraj Marga, Sri Vijaya's The King's Way for poets, which, like the verse immediately before that, like Swayambhu's handbook, written in the middle of the 9th century. So the first verse combines Sanskrit and Kannada words in a bad, nasty way. The second verse does it in a nicer way, but ignore that. I want to emphasize how every word in these two verses is actually a pair of words, and this is a translationally equivalent pair. So, Arasu Kumaranan, Arasu, it's actually we can think of it conceptually as a pair of Arasu and Narapati. Same thing with basically all of the other words. Karegan is Apanga, and so on. So the requirement that regional languages must translate the poetic vocabulary of Sanskrit if they are to serve as literary languages is another way of talking about what Sheldon Pollock has called the Cosmopolitan Vernacular. And he used this phrase to describe I quote here, a synthetic register of an emergent regional literary language that localizes the full spectrum of expressive qualities of the superposed cosmopolitan code. That's the end of the quote. We now know that Dandin's mirror was central to this project in ways that I think we're all here to figure out in their specificity. My impression is that there's a particular Dandin touch to the Cosmopolitan Vernacular in at least some of its manifestations. Of course, the process of grafting the transregional vocabulary onto of Sanskrit onto the regional languages is independent of the mirror. It gets started before Dandin starts writing, and I don't want to overstate Dandin's influence on this process. But I do think that the mirror allows us to look at this process and understand it in the same terms that people who are actually producing literature and literary theory in regional languages are understanding this process. And that is a process of reconfiguration of a linguistic field that maintains the internal structure of that field. And above all, its basis in Sanskrit. And it redeploys the poetic vocabulary, which is a Sanskrit vocabulary, as I said, across this newly reconfigured field. So I'll say in conclusion that Dandin's restriction of the languages of Kavya to 3 has an empirical quality. So those are the languages of the tradition in which he places himself. I think that's definitely true. That does not make it arbitrary, and I don't think Dandin does anything without a reason and without some motivation. He articulated the interrelations between these languages, and above all between Sanskrit and Prakrit. And in doing that, he showed what a language needs to be like, how it must be seen, how it must be analyzed. We can think of it slightly in wider terms as what actual forms of knowledge are necessary for this project. So he showed what needs to happen in order for a language to become a member of the set of literary languages. And so he opened the door to projects like Sri Vijay's and many others, even as he seemed to be closing it. And I think arguably he helped to determine the character of the regional languages that were used in projects like that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andrew. Maybe I should just say that those of you who have not yet read Andrew's dissertation should try to do so by the end of the week. It will perhaps change your life. We have 20 minutes. Andrew, you know the people. You can manage this yourself.
Yeah. Vic. Oh, I have. So I'll just.
I'd like to raise 2 points. Number one is the concept of deshabhasha, which I didn't hear you talk about, but I think it would be a useful one to use. When the Buddha was preaching his Dharma, some brahmanas who were his disciples, wannabe disciples, came to him and said, "You should spread your Dharma in Sanskrit." And he said, "No, deshabhasha." And this word deshabhasha actually, when translated into Chinese, is guoyu, which is ultimately now it's the word for Mandarin, which means national languages. So I think this using this notion of deshabhasha might be useful for you in your analysis and in our discussions of this. The second point is I really liked when you talked about mutual intelligibility as maybe being not such a useful concept, even though I often myself invoke this in discussions of dialect versus language. But I'd rather suggest that maybe we can talk about the idea of levels or registers. And I'll give an example of how this works. In the Wayang tradition in Indonesia, I don't know how many of you have ever gone to a wayang kulit performance, a shadow play performance. There are many different kinds of wayangs. There's a scroll which I've written about a lot, a wayang beber, which is on a scroll. But anyway, the performer is called a dalang. And he has a gamelan, which is an orchestra behind him. And so the dalang, he speaks in as many as 5 different registers. And the lower registers could be very, I would say probably like Bahasa kind of language. the higher registers get to be more and more Sanskritic. So here we're even we're even crossing different language families, different groups. But you know, I remember a performance of Untitled I went to at Harvard, maybe in the 70s, and they did something very, very interesting. So normally when people are listening to a Untitled performance, when the Dalang gets into the higher registers, they can't really follow him. I mean, it becomes unintelligible. So the Dalang in this performance I saw at Harvard, they electronically manipulated his voice so that you could, he's speaking in English, you know, it's in translation. But then they started to do bizarre things electronically with his voice, so you could sort of strain, and it's like you're shifting into another register. By the time they distort it to a certain extent, he's still speaking English, but it's beyond your comprehension. So the last thing I wanted to say is that sure, there's no problem for me at all to think that Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Abhiramshas are all one big family, but maybe we can think about them in terms of levels of registers.
With regard to Deshapasha, I mean, this is the Sanskrit word that underlies my use of regional languages, and I think that this is the whole problem of how you make a Deshapasha into a language that is capable of literature and one that you can write literature in. And I think that there's a very long history to that. This incident from the Buddhist canon is part of that. But in Dandin's world, it takes on this very precise dimension of, I think, how to preserve the kind of aesthetic qualities that you find in Sanskrit kavya, and how you're able to do the very similar types of things across languages that are actually not related to each other at all. And so how you kind of place them within the same imaginative world. That brings me to the second point of different levels. You know, when I say that they constitute a single space and it's all, you can in theory go from one language to another using these sometimes articulated, sometimes unarticulated forms of knowledge. In theory, yes. In fact, like I mentioned a few times, people were not always doing this, and they usually stuck to one of these languages. And I think that for a lot of people, Prakrit was something that they weren't particularly interested in, or Abhiramsha especially was something that only kind of Abhiramsha poets did, even though it's notionally related to Sanskrit along the same dimensions. But there is a very large theory-practice divide when it comes to the language order. Yeah. Janet, and then.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I don't really know how to phrase this question. You know, I just don't understand this whole thing. So when you think about like a figure having to do with similarity and dissimilarity, right, and playing off between each other, is there something special about Sanskrit that can work that in ways that other languages can't?
No.
So I just don't understand this whole problem. I mean, suppose we would just say that, you know, Dandin and the other people that he's responding to simply, you know, maybe we're marginally aware of the existence of entirely different language groups like Chinese or Tibetan. But just, it's like they just couldn't handle talking about it. So so he's talking about very interesting relationships between Sanskrit and languages that are, pretty much, versions of Sanskrit, more localized. And that's what the issue is about. And that's a very important and interesting issue, but it doesn't say anything, when you're looking at how the Kavyadarsha inspires an English poet or a Tibetan poet and so on. The issue about whether it's Sanskrit or some other well-articulated classical language, right, that's not even at stake, right?
No. So I'm not saying that Sanskrit is the only language in which it's conceivably possible to write poetry, but I'm saying that the actual substance and the form and the style of Dandin's Kavyadarsha and all of the other reflections of the mirror have many things in common, and one of the things that they have in common is the use of this vocabulary.
The vocabulary of like the alamkaras.
The vocabulary of alamkaras.
Right.
But it's not just a list of alamkaras, it's the things that are figured in the figures. And there are certain things that you talk about. The descriptions of the seasons, kind of prashasti type themes. Dandin is the whole package, and he packages all of this stuff in such a way that it can be translated into other languages.
All right, I'll just leave it here for you.
Yeah, Whitney and then Larry and then Gil.
I want to go maybe back over the ground of Janet's question. So first of all, I want to go back. I mean, so you're very careful in the way you used this idea of the generativity of the model, and I'm going to go. I was taking notes as you were saying it, and I want to go back over kind of what you just said. But let me read back to you what I wrote down and see if that makes sense. So when talking about the upama as a kind of model figure of sense, and you said you didn't want to talk about upamanas and upameyas, rather you wanted to talk about, as it were, the sub-basement of that, which are these referential relationships that are pre-established prasiddha in Sanskrit, such that then, this is the part where my question comes, so then upamana and upameya, as such, as conceptual categories, become, as it were, surface expressions of these underlying already existing relationships, semantic relationships. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. What I want to do then is, in using that, if I'm right in my understanding of that, is I want to go back to you. It went by very quickly, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk again a little bit about the way you cited, and the way you brought in the Kaviraj Marga as your one example of a vernacularization here. So is what you're saying is that idea, the idea of the sub-basement of the clearly established referential relationships in Sanskrit, then provides us with the raw materials by which to make second-order identifications which form alankaras. That then provides itself a generative model for something like we see here, where there's equations being made, in this case, sort of equations of synonymy being made across what we moderns would call across language families, between an Indo-Aryan vocable and a Dravidian vocable.
Right.
So Adasu equals Narapati.
Right.
In the same, so is the claim then that logic that we see exemplified in this passage from the Kaviraj Marga derives from the intellectual toolbox that Dandin gives you?
I think so, yeah. I mean, that's very clearly the case, because not in this verse in particular, because it deals with a problem that never came up for Dandin, but I mean, the Sri Vijaya's project is inspired by Dandin in a lot of ways. I think that throughout this verse, if you think of other examples, Tavare and Sarisija, there are words that are the same, and it doesn't matter. We can think of them as having the same meaning in Rajasekhara's term, but undergoing some kind of transformation. And whether that's a transformation from Sanskrit into Prakrit or from Sanskrit into Kannada, it's still a transformation and therefore still part of the same space. And I think that it's important to maintain the particularity and the concreteness of that space, to kind of come back to Janet's question, because kavya is not any type of relationship of similarity, even though later Alankarikas will kind of conceptualize it and think of Rudrita. It's really, if somebody is comparing an airplane to a toaster, that's not kavya. There are certain I think that for Dandin that would not be recognized as part of the same world. And it's not just, it would be there are lots of things that we can say are similar to each other and different from each other, but I think that one of the things that Dandin does is he kind of lays out the things that kavya is about, as well as the kind of underlying principles of combination. Implicitly through his examples. Yeah.
It is not necessary to follow everything to Dandin.
Oh, no, exactly.
What Kaviraj Marga is saying is a particular problem of Kannada. You see, in Kannada we have the Tadbhava words and also Deshi words as well as Sanskrit words.
Right.
What Kaviraj Marga is trying to say is, when you are making a compound, it is not right to combine a Deshi word and a Sanskrit word.
Yeah. That's the underlying point.
And that problem was not there before Dandin.
Yes,
and this is an original idea of Kaviraj Marga itself.
Right, no, exactly.
Dandin has nothing to do about that.
Yeah. But the word, I think that thinking of these words as translational equivalents is something that Dandin does allow you to do. There were a few, Gil, and then Devin Yugal, and Megaskufra. If we have some.
Thank you. Maybe in a way continuing Nagaraja Rao's comment, and also Janet's, what Janet started as this complex relationship between the Sanskrit literary model and the regional languages. I'm wondering if what you are bringing here is not derived out of this special Kannada linguistic landscape where, in a way, despite what Nagaraja Rao just commented about the Arya Samasas, right, this kind of illegal mixture of Dravidian, Deshi words and Sanskritic words, what's unique here in this particular world is that they are all considered Kannada, right? Even the usage of the Sanskrit words as Samasamskritas or Tadbhavas, right. Kannada in a weird way feels comfortable with everyone, lexically. And that works very well with what you presented as this, in order to compose kavya, you have to be Sanskrit. So Kannada does this very comfortably. Mm-hmm. In a way that doesn't happen in Tamil, as far as I know, and probably becomes less and less clear as we move away linguistically from this world. So I wanted to comment and ask you about that.
Yeah, you have.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said about this final vocabulary, because now I would give you an example from Sinhala language, where women who are walking in the street are described not by any upameya, but only the collection of upamanas are given as a list, and one has to make the meaning of those. Because now I will just give you what the example is. Sunil Vala Nava Sanda Nilu Pul Pabalu Vimal Sakngi Jindu Kumbu Siri Vasa Bebelu Lakal Pulina Ramba Sikki Gala Mutu Ladalu Lakal Ranali An Sarana Balayahalu. This is from a Sandesha where people are requested to see the beautiful women, but the list of upamanas are Sunilwala, that is very blue, clouds, Navasandha, new moon. You know this, it refers to the face. Pabalu refers to lips. Vimal Sak Gijindu. Vimal Sak is this Sakki Shankar, which Vimal Sak Gijindu Kumbu, elephants, 4 fronts like breasts. So like that, Kumbu Sirivasa, Srivatsa, that is this part of the body. Right. So these are all in the Tadbhava forms, but the language, as you said, after the introduction of this Varnana type of thing by Kavyadarsha, which was taken very seriously by the Sinhalese poets, they coined certain words when you use them, you don't need to give the upameya, but just upamanas alone will carry the meaning. So that's, I think, what you said. And as far as Sinhala language goes, this is, I can agree with you totally, because all the poets use this kind of upamanas in their vocabulary. So this leads to what you said, that there is kind of a final vocabulary, you know, as far as our language is concerned. So it could be something like a Prakrit language, but of course Sinhalese language is full of Tamil, English, Portuguese, Dutch, and all the languages in the world. Sanskrit and Pali, of course, more words. But within all those things, we have these Tadbhavas which have come through the Kavi Marga of the Dandin.
Yeah, and that's also a good example of the kind of inherent relations or innate relations between these different types of objects in such a way that they can suggest their upameyas without ever being stated explicitly. I mean, it shows up in the Prahelika section as well. There was Deven and then Yigal, and then we'll probably have to stop.
Thank you, Andrew. Really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things have already been said about this this question of the translatability of the sort of terms between the regional and Dandin, and the ways in which they enter into certain kinds of relations that you're identifying. It seems like, with just from my own experience with reading this Kaviraja Marga, or working on it at least, is that it's that makes a lot more sense in the 3rd chapter with the terms of the alankaras. But I'm thinking that what's interesting is the spaces that the vocabulary opens up where the relations aren't entered into so clearly, right? Such as, for example, the use of the word marga. The ways in which the Kannada text deals with what marga means, and just the complexity of the, it actually obfuscates the issue on some level. I mean, it's unclear in Dandin also, but so in that way there could be a relationship there. But that's what's interesting. I think what you're saying is that in some ways that these transfers of terminologies and certain kinds of conceptualizations, it's where the space is opened up to create more complexity and even further avenues for exploration. I think that's what's interesting. I think what you're saying, and so I'm wondering if if you've considered that in vis-a-vis the example you gave with the linguistic aspects and the sort of how grammar enters into it, that are specifically Kannada problems, but then you've also, I think you're referring particularly to the Alankara, and seeing that kind of translatabilities between the languages. But I'm wondering if you've given thought to how issues of the sort of specificities of things, in terms of style or certain kinds of, or even the aesthetic aspects which are uniquely regional, and how that translates.
No, it's a good question, and I don't have a ready answer for it. But I think that Alankara is just part of the picture, and I think that Dandin wants us to see that. I mean, when we're putting these elements into different figural combinations, that's you can think of a Jacobsonian way of thinking about it. There's an axis of selection, and you're selecting these things from certain things go together with other things, and there's a kind of logic to their combination that doesn't only appear in the alankaras. I mean, if you begin with an image like a marga, then there are certain other things that go along with it. Just like if you begin with a moonlit night, there are certain things that go along with it. And this is not exactly answering your question, but yeah, it is a thought there. Okay, sure.
Oh, sorry. I have the microphone.
So I just want to say I love this talk, and I think the move here from thinking of Sanskrit as a meta language for literature to thinking of it as the ultimate vocabulary for literature is very, very convincing and very productive in the way that we can use it in our future conversations. I have a question, but what happens and how do you see this inscribed in Dandin's text, where the kavya or the model is translated without some of these semantimes into a new ultimate vocabulary? This is something that I think we've seen to some extent in the old Javanese poetry, where different kavi-samayas, different pasidis, different. I mean, you see a lot that comes with the Sanskrit, but you see it feels very different at the same time. Do you see that also inscribed in Dandin's?
I don't know. I cannot possibly answer that. But I mean, Old Javanese is an interesting case because Dandin's presence is not explicitly there in the same way. So that might have something to do with it.
There was one more question.
Janet raised, and I was wondering whether it would be useful to revisit Panini's definition of Aryavarta and its borders. Yeah, sorry, Patanjali is what I was talking. To see whether this classification fits within the definition, and whether that would explain why Tokharian is not there, or why.
Well, that's a good suggestion
to which point he.
But that was maybe a bad example. But you could think of something that also, there's certain practices within Aryavarta that are definitely not considered kavya, and one of the reasons for that, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is that they're not in Sanskrit, those practices. So,
very obvious when it's Pali, which is
right.
probably his mother tongue.
Well, maybe that's in Aryavarta, maybe not. But
yeah, that's why I thought it would be useful to see
exactly.
see the revisit this definition and see the boundaries may explain.
No, thank you. Thanks.
We're going to have to stop, but only a brief stop. We will reconvene at 11:30 exactly. Okay.